At the grocery store, beef prices have hit record highs in recent years. Shoppers see ground beef over $6 a pound and steaks well into the double digits, and many assume ranchers must be raking in cash. In June 2025, the average retail price of ground beef in the U.S. reached $6.12 per pound, an all-time high. That was up sharply from about $5.47 the year before. In Canada, retail beef prices have climbed as well. The average was around $22.26 per kilogram, about $10 per pound in 2024, roughly 6% higher than the previous year, according to industry reports. Beef and veal prices overall were nearly 14% higher in 2025 than a year prior. Consumers are understandably shocked by these price tags. But here's the twist. Even as beef at the meat counter has never been more expensive, ranchers raising the cattle aren't cashing in on these highs. In fact, there's a growing gap between grocery store prices and what cattle ranchers actually receive. For every dollar a consumer spends on beef, only about 39 cents goes back to the farmers and ranchers who raised the animal. A few decades ago, ranchers' share was closer to 60 cents on the dollar. That means if you're paying $10 for a package of steaks, less than $4 of that value is making it to the ranch. The rest is absorbed further down the supply chain by processors, distributors, retailers, and other costs. Consumers often assume high prices equal high profits for producers, but that's usually not the case. The truth is, the people tending cattle on the range have been squeezed by rising costs and low margins, even as you pay more at the store. To put it bluntly, America's ranchers aren't getting rich off expensive beef. Many are actually struggling to break even or worse. A Colorado analysis showed that in 2022, the average rancher spent about $100 more per cow than they earned from selling it. Think about that. Even with beef prices climbing 28% at retail from 2018 to 2022, cattle producers saw their profits vanish. In 2018, an average cow-calf producer in Colorado might have made a small profit, about $20 per cow. By 2022, they lost money on each animal. Their revenue per cow was roughly $872, while costs averaged $972. So even as you watched your grocery bill go up, ranchers were feeling the pinch on the other side. This disconnect between record-high beef prices and razor-thin or negative rancher profits is the crux of our story, and it's fueled by a tangle of factors that we'll break down in this video. If ranchers aren't seeing $6 a pound for ground beef, what do they get paid? The answer: ranchers earn money on live cattle, usually quoted per hundredweight, 100 pounds, or per animal, and those prices are far lower than retail beef prices. For example, in late 2024 and 2025, U.S. cattle prices hit all-time highs, around the equivalent of $1.70 to $2 per pound of live weight for finished steers at one point, which was a record. In early 2025, one Alberta rancher, Bob Lowe, former Canadian Cattle Association president, noted, "We are seeing record prices. It's nice to be selling cattle right now." He gave a striking example. At a feeder cattle sale, he paid nearly $3,000 for a 600-pound yearling calf, roughly $5 per pound, the highest he'd ever paid. That means the rancher who raised that calf got about $3,000 for it. But consider, by the time that animal is fed to market weight, processed, and its beef is on supermarket shelves, the total value of all the meat from it will be much higher, spread across dozens of packages of steaks, roasts, and ground beef. The rancher's cut is just the first slice of a much larger pie. Crucially, ranchers' costs have been skyrocketing. Feed, fuel, and labor, the big three inputs on any cattle operation, have all become a lot more expensive in recent years. Feed is often the single largest cost in raising cattle, and prices for feed grains and hay have surged. Drought across much of the U.S. and Canadian prairies made hay scarce and costly, and corn, the primary feed for finished cattle, hit its highest prices in a decade during 2021 to 2022. Ranchers, who typically grow their own feed or buy it cheaply, suddenly faced steep bills for hay and grain. At the same time, diesel fuel prices spiked, especially in 2022, meaning it cost far more to run tractors, haul water, or truck cattle to market. Labor costs are up too. Whether it's hired ranch hands or meatpacking plant workers, wages have had to increase to attract and retain staff. All these inputs eat into the rancher's bottom line. One livestock economist explained that by 2022, these higher costs flipped the economics. Even though cattle prices had improved from a few years prior, the cost to raise each calf outpaced the market price. In other words, raising cattle has simply become a more expensive business across the board. Then, Mother Nature added insult to injury. Severe droughts in the U.S. and Canada have forced many ranchers to shrink their herds, which ironically contributes to high beef prices now, but was devastating for producers at the time. Cattle need grass and water. When pastures dried up and feed prices soared, ranchers had no choice but to sell off animals. From 2020 through 2022, huge swaths of cattle country, from Texas up through the plains and western Canada, were in drought. Grass didn't grow, hay was hard to find, and ranchers faced the gut-wrenching decision to cull breeding cows they could no longer afford to keep. As a result, the North American cattle herd plummeted to its lowest level in decades. By early 2023, the United States cattle inventory had dwindled to about 86.7 million head, the smallest herd since 1951. The beef cow herd, mother cows, in the U.S. is now at its lowest since around 1961. Canada has seen a similar long-term decline in cow numbers. This supply crunch is a big reason beef prices are up, but it wasn't a windfall for most ranchers. Many of them had to liquidate animals at unfavorable times. When everyone in the region is selling due to drought, cattle prices can actually dip from the glut of sales. One Missouri extension expert put it simply: multiple years of drought and low profitability forced beef producers to shrink their herds. The herd cuts were a survival move, not a strategic profit play. So what ranchers get paid is a function of live cattle prices, and those did eventually rise to record highs by 2024-25, thanks to the reduced supply. But by then, many ranchers had fewer cattle left to sell, and they were digging out of a financial hole created by years of high costs. It's telling that even as cattle prices hit records in 2025, a lot of that money was merely offsetting the higher expense of feed, fuel, and fertilizer, and the smaller calf crop ranchers had on hand. The price per pound went up, but the profit per head didn't necessarily follow suit. Ranchers are finally seeing better checks at the auction barn now, but it's often just enough to cover the bills, not a big payday.
Here's a hidden piece of the puzzle: the meatpacking bottleneck. Between the ranch gate and the grocery store lies the processing stage, and it's dominated by a few giant companies. In the United States, just 4 meatpacking firms process about 85% of all beef in the market. Think about that. 4 companies handle essentially the vast majority of cattle coming out of feedlots. The big 4 are Tyson Foods, Cargill, JBS, and National Beef, owned by Marfrig, and they exert enormous influence. President Biden even pointed out in 2022 that this lack of competition allows packers to drive up their own profits and squeeze everyone else, saying capitalism without competition is exploitation when referring to the beef packing oligopoly. And he had a point. A White House analysis found that those 4 big packers saw their profit margins explode, with gross profits up 120% since the pandemic, and net incomes up 500% for some, while cattle producers were being underpaid. In short, a handful of companies control the middle of the beef supply chain, and they've been very adept at profiting from it. The situation is even more extreme in Canada. Two multinational companies, Brazil's JBS and US-based Cargill, account for about 84% of Canada's beef processing. Add a third, smaller plant, Harmony Beef, and over 90% of Canadian beef is processed by just 3 facilities, all clustered in Western Canada. It's an efficient system when it works, but it's highly concentrated. This concentration is the choke point in the beef supply chain. With so few players and plants, packers have a lot of power to set prices. They essentially can dictate what they'll pay ranchers for cattle, because if you're a producer with a pen of cattle ready for slaughter, you often have only a couple of potential buyers. It also means that if anything goes wrong at one of those big plants, the whole system wobbles. We saw this vividly in 2019 and 2020. A fire at a Tyson Foods plant in Kansas in 2019 took out a major processing facility overnight, and cattle prices dropped immediately because suddenly there was nowhere for many fat cattle to go. In 2020, COVID-19 outbreaks forced the temporary closure of huge packing plants, including Cargill's High River plant in Alberta, which processes nearly half of Canada's beef. In that case, the plant had to idle when hundreds of workers fell ill. The result? Cattle backed up on farms, and prices paid to ranchers plummeted, even as consumers saw empty meat cases and higher retail prices due to shortages. When one or two plants handle such a large share, there's no slack in the system. Cattle ranchers suddenly couldn't get their animals processed, creating a glut of live cattle that drove farm prices down. At the same time, less beef was reaching grocery stores, pushing consumer prices up. The price difference between what farmers were paid and what consumers paid widened, and that gap went to packers and retailers in the middle. Even in normal times, this bottleneck affects margins. Lack of competition in meatpacking means ranchers often have to take whatever price the big buyers offer. For years in the late 2010s and 2020s, ranchers complained that while retail beef prices kept climbing, cattle prices stagnated. We can actually quantify that. In Alberta, Canada, the provincial data showed that between January 2021 and January 2022, the price packers paid for slaughter cattle stayed virtually flat, yet Canadian retail beef prices jumped 15.4% in that same period. In the U.S., similar trends were noted. Wholesale and retail beef prices were soaring in 2021, but the prices to cattle producers did not keep pace, boosting packer profit margins to record levels. The Big Four processors were effectively able to pay ranchers less while charging consumers more because they faced little competition and could capitalize on strong beef demand. Another aspect of the bottleneck is simply limited processing capacity. The U.S. beef packing industry today processes fewer plants than decades ago. Many smaller slaughterhouses have closed, leaving just these huge facilities. If cattle numbers surge beyond processing capacity, producers are stuck. Conversely, as we see now with low cattle inventories, the packers are actually running below capacity and competing for fewer cattle, which has finally given ranchers a bit of leverage and driven cattle prices up. But during the herd liquidation phase, when there were more cattle than kill slots, it was the opposite. Packers could leverage the oversupply to keep bids low. It's a cyclical power dynamic, but structurally, the packers usually have the upper hand. Consolidation in meatpacking has fundamentally tilted the market against individual ranchers and small feeders. It's the bottleneck nobody talks about in that consumer discussions of high food prices rarely mention meatpacker concentration, but folks in the cattle business know it well. There are even efforts now by producer groups to build new smaller packing plants or cooperative processors so ranchers can bypass the big guys and earn a better share of the beef dollar. For now, though, the four giants and their Canadian counterparts dominate, and their presence is a key reason why high beef prices at the store haven't translated to high profits at the ranch. The money gets made in the middle.
Beef is a global commodity, and what happens around the world can drive prices up or down in North America. One big factor is international demand. Both the U.S. and Canada are major beef exporters. In 2022, the United States exported about $11.7 billion worth of beef and beef products. Key markets like South Korea, Japan, and China account for over 60% of those exports by value. South Korea alone bought $2.7 billion of U.S. beef in 2022. Canada, with its smaller population, exports an even larger share of its beef production. Roughly 50% of Canadian beef is sent abroad. When overseas demand is strong, it pushes prices higher for everyone. For example, in recent years, China's growing middle class has developed a taste for beef. China went from importing almost no North American beef due to past trade restrictions to becoming a top 3 export market practically overnight. That added a big new buyer competing for the same steaks and burgers, which contributes to price increases at home. Global demand for beef is robust, and ranchers in North America, being efficient producers, are tapped to supply a good chunk of it. Currency and trade policies also play a role. If the US dollar is very strong, American beef becomes more expensive for foreign buyers, which can cool export demand and potentially weigh on US cattle prices. Conversely, a weaker Canadian dollar makes Canadian beef cheaper on the world market, which can be a boon for Canadian ranchers. Their cattle fetch relatively more in local currency when exported. Trade agreements, or trade wars, can swing prices too. Tariffs, quotas, or bans can abruptly redirect beef flows. We've seen this recently. In mid-2025, the U.S. government moved to halt imports of live cattle from Mexico after the discovery of New World screwworm in Mexican livestock. American feedlots, especially in Texas and the Southwest, rely on Mexican feeder cattle imports to fill pens. That border closure tightened the supply of cattle available for finishing in the U.S., which in turn supports higher prices for domestic feeder cattle. Good for U.S. ranchers in the short run, though it could squeeze feedlots. Around the same time, the U.S. slapped a 50% tariff on beef imports from Brazil. Brazil is a major global beef supplier, often for cheaper cuts and grinding beef. That tariff was aimed at protecting U.S. producers and shoring up domestic prices, but it also meant less imported beef to help meet demand, putting upward pressure on U.S. beef prices for consumers. Essentially, when countries start tweaking trade levers, whether opening up to more imports or slapping tariffs to curb them, it can have immediate effects on supply and prices. Disease and health scares are another global pressure. The cattle industry is always on guard for outbreaks that can upend trade. A single case of a serious livestock disease can close export markets overnight. Ranchers in Canada remember this all too well. In 2003, a cow in Alberta was confirmed to have BSE, mad cow disease, and virtually all of Canada's export markets shut their doors immediately. Canada typically exported half its beef, and suddenly that beef had nowhere to go. Domestically, there was a huge oversupply. As one Canadian rancher put it, "We had to eat it." All that extra beef flooded the Canadian market, and the price of cattle went down to virtually nothing. Many producers went broke or left the industry after that shock, and some of those wounds never healed. Even in the U.S., which wasn't the epicenter of that BSE event, the ripple effects were felt and led to years of increased testing and restrictions. Other diseases like foot and mouth disease, or FMD, are a constant worry. The U.S. hasn't had an FMD outbreak since 1929, but if it did, exports would halt instantly, and the domestic market would be overwhelmed with unsellable cattle. The mere threat of such diseases influences policy. For instance, the U.S. maintains a stock guard in Panama to keep certain pests and diseases from moving north from South America. Climate shocks in other countries also feed back to us. Australia, one of the world's top beef exporters, has cycled through severe droughts and floods, which cause wild swings in its cattle herd. During drought years, Australia slaughters a lot of cattle because they can't feed them, which temporarily boosts global supply and can cap prices. But then their herd is smaller, and they need to rebuild, which means they export less for a few years, tightening global supply and contributing to higher prices elsewhere. Similarly, if a major producing region in South America is hit by a bad drought, or conversely, a bumper pasture year, it affects how much beef they put on the world market. North American prices respond to these signals. Global beef supply and demand is like a big balance scale. When one side of the world raises output or drops demand, it tilts prices for everyone. And with beef, it's a slow-moving ship. Rebuilding a national herd takes years, so these global shocks have lasting effects. On the demand side, globally, we also have trends like rising incomes in Asia, diet fads, for example, high-protein diets increasing meat consumption worldwide, and even things like international promotions. Think fast food chains expanding in new countries, driving up beef usage. When more people in more places want a finite supply of beef, prices rise. North American consumers effectively compete with consumers around the world for each steak. Lastly, consider input costs and economics on a global scale. Fertilizer prices, oil prices, and exchange rates all influence the cost of producing beef in each country, which can shift comparative advantages. If, say, grain prices spike worldwide, feedlot operations in grain importing countries might cut back, reducing beef output. Or if a country's currency crashes, its beef might become super cheap for foreigners to buy, which could flood the export market. All these global crosscurrents end up reflected in the price you pay for beef and in the volatility ranchers face. The bottom line of this segment: beef prices don't rise or fall just based on local ranch conditions. Global pressures like export demand, trade policies, currency swings, disease outbreaks, and climate events are all part of the story.
After everything we've discussed, drought, high input costs, consolidation, global demand, it might seem logical that with cattle numbers down sharply, the ranchers who remain would finally be making higher profits. Supply is down, prices are up. Shouldn't that be great for producers? This is the classic cattle cycle expectation, and indeed, those ranchers who have cattle to sell in 2024, 2025 are getting much better prices per head than a few years ago. But here's the reality check. Fewer cattle doesn't automatically mean higher profits for the average rancher, especially not enough to recover years of struggle. There are several reasons why the ranching community isn't simply swimming in money right now, even with record beef prices. First, many producers had to downsize their herds during the bad years, selling off breeding cows and young heifers just to survive the drought and cost crunch. Those sales often happened at middling prices because everyone was selling at once. Now, with prices high, they have fewer animals left to capitalize on the high market. Imagine a rancher who had 200 cows before the drought, but had to sell 50 of them when pasture dried up. Today, that rancher might be selling calves from 150 cows instead of 200. Even if each calf fetches a record price, their total revenue might not exceed what it was with a larger herd in a normal market. In economic terms, volume is down, so total revenue doesn't soar as much as the per head price would suggest. This is why we can have a situation where beef production is down about 5%, but retail prices are up about 15%, and yet ranchers aren't all driving new trucks. They're often just catching up on deferred maintenance and bills. Second, the cost side of the equation remains high. High cattle prices tend to trigger cost increases too. For instance, when calves are worth more, feedlots bid up the price of feeders, which is good for cow-calf producers selling calves, but then feedlots face higher break-evens and will pay more for feed. Landlords might raise pasture rent now that cattle are more valuable. Equipment, fuel, and feed costs haven't really come down dramatically from the inflation surge. So even though ranchers are getting more dollars per animal, a lot of those dollars go straight out to pay for expensive hay, fuel for irrigation pumps, higher interest on operating loans, and so on. One analysis by the USDA showed that while cattle prices were improving, high volatility and input costs continued to make profitability challenging for farmers. In fact, the average net return on cow-calf operations was negative in recent years when you factor in full costs, including overhead.
So the current high prices might just be bringing that net income up to around break even for some. It's less of a bonanza and more of a lifeline. Third, herd rebuilding is a slow and cautious process, and it's necessary for long-term profit, but painful in the short term. If a rancher today decides, okay, prices are high, time to expand the herd again, what do? They hold back more heifers from slaughter to become new mother cows, but every heifer you retain for breeding is one you don't sell this year. It's like a farmer keeping seeds rather than selling grain. It's an investment. In the meantime, beef supply gets even tighter. Those heifers are entering the meat supply, which could push prices even higher for a while. This helps those selling cattle, but the ranchers who are keeping heifers are foregoing income now in hopes of a bigger herd and more calves to sell a few years down the line. It's a tough decision. Do you take the cash now or bet on the future? Many ranchers are understandably wary. They recall that after the last big herd rebuild around 2014-2015, cattle prices crashed by 2016 as supply caught up with demand. No one wants to be the one who expanded right before the peak and then loses money when the cycle turns. High interest rates today add another hurdle. Borrowing money to buy more cattle or land is expensive, so expanding or even financing current operations is challenging. The average rancher is nearing 60 years old. Many are not eager to take on new debt or risks at this stage. They might prefer to sell into the high market, pay down debt, and consolidate, rather than double down and expand. So the herd will likely rebuild slowly. That's good for keeping prices high in the interim, but it means we won't see a rapid boost in production or a big jump in rancher revenues either.
Now, let's talk about scale and survival. In tough industries, bigger operators often weather storms better than small ones, and ranching is no exception. Larger ranches and integrated operations have some advantages. They can buy feed in bulk, spread their fixed costs over more animals, and often have better access to capital and markets. When times are lean, they might have the reserves or credit lines to hang on. Smaller family ranches, especially those without other sources of income, have a thinner margin for error. Unfortunately, many small ranchers have had to exit the business over the past decade. The number of beef cattle producers in the U.S. has been on a long decline, and the recent hardships accelerated that. The 2022 USDA Census of Agriculture reported fewer farms and ranches than 5 years prior, the smallest number since the 1950s, indicating consolidation in agriculture is continuing. A lot of the folks who sold off cows during the drought won't be coming back. As Bob Lowe observed about Canada's industry post-BSE, people just got sick of it and they left the industry and they haven't returned. This trend is creating a scenario where the ranching sector is increasingly dominated by those who either have the scale, efficiency, and financial backing to survive the bad times, or those who found niche markets to add value, like organic grass-fed operations selling direct to consumers. The mid-sized traditional rancher is the one most squeezed. Who survives versus who struggles often comes down to diversification and adaptability. Many ranching families have adapted by diversifying their income, maybe farming crops alongside cattle or taking off-season jobs or agritourism just to spread the risk. Others have formed cooperatives or alliances to get better marketing power for their cattle. Some have invested in value-added programs, for example, raising specialty breeds or hormone-free beef that can fetch a premium. Ranchers who can run a tight ship and keep costs low, for instance by owning their land outright, utilizing regenerative grazing to improve forage without expensive inputs, etc., have a better chance at profitability. Meanwhile, a rancher who is heavily leveraged, big loans for land or equipment, might see high interest costs eat up any gains from cattle prices. It also matters where you ranch. Regions with reliable rainfall and good pasture recovered faster, whereas those in chronic drought are seeing producers give up. The infrastructure around you matters too. If you're in an area with access to competitive livestock auctions or local packers, you might get a better price than someone who has one buyer within 300 miles. All these micro factors determine if a ranch family can make it.
In essence, the cattle industry is in a paradoxical spot. We have the fewest cattle in decades, and beef is expensive, yet it's not a uniformly happy story for producers. Some are finally seeing black ink on their balance sheets after years of red, but others have already thrown in the towel or aren't seeing much improvement due to lingering high costs. Profitability in ranching remains a razor-thin proposition that depends on timing, management, and often plain luck with weather and markets. To conclude this reality check, fewer cattle didn't simply equal higher ranch profits because the value of those record beef prices is unevenly split. The big meat companies, the exporters, the retailers, they've often taken a hefty cut. Ranchers, especially smaller ones, are often price takers with limited power to set their terms. Even now, with strong cattle markets, they are using the opportunity to rebuild or stabilize rather than to luxuriate in windfall profits. The cattle cycle will turn eventually. If ranchers expand herds, supply will increase and prices will moderate or drop in a few years, testing producers yet again. It's a continual balancing act. So, why do beef prices keep rising even when ranchers are struggling? Because the cost pressures, market structures, and global forces in the beef supply chain have created a system where consumers pay more, but that money doesn't necessarily flow back to the ranch. Until things change, be it through better competition in meat packing, policy shifts, or a more equitable supply chain, we'll likely continue to see this disconnect. Ranchers will keep working long, hard days caring for their cattle, battling weather and market volatility, hoping that the next cycle will be kinder. And consumers will keep seeing high prices at the meat counter, perhaps not realizing that the folks who raise that beef are fighting just to survive in the business. This has been the story behind the steak, a story of record prices, tight supplies, and an often forgotten protagonist, the struggling rancher.